In the depths of the Amazon rainforest, where civilization ends and nature reclaims its throne, there exists a bond that defies all understanding. When humans venture too far into territories that were never meant for them, they often discover that the most unlikely protector can emerge from the shadows. This is not a tale of man versus beast, but rather the extraordinary account of loyalty that transcends species, intelligence that surpasses instinct, and a friendship forged in the crucible of survival. What happens when a creature dismissed by many as merely a pet becomes the thin line between life and death for an entire camp of researchers? What drives an animal to risk everything for beings who are not of its kind? And when darkness falls and danger approaches on silent feet, who truly becomes the hunter and who becomes the prey? This is the true story of courage that roared in the night, of bonds that proved unbreakable, and of a guardian who understood that some things are worth fighting for, even unto death. Dr. J's. Sarah Martinez never expected her life's work to lead her into the heart of the Amazon, and she certainly never imagined that her survival would depend on a creature that most people would cross the street to avoid. The research camp sat like a small island of human civilization surrounded by an ocean of green that stretched endlessly in every direction. 12 dedicated scientists had made this remote location their temporary home, studying the intricate ecosystem that thrived in one of Earth's last untouched wilderness areas. The camp consisted of several weathered canvas tents, a central research station built from local timber, and a small communications tower that connected them to the outside world through sporadic satellite signals. Solar panels provided limited electricity, and a nearby stream supplied fresh water after proper filtration. Everything they needed had been flown in by helicopter 3 months earlier, and they wouldn't see another aircraft until the end of their 6-month study period. Among the team members, Sarah stood out not just for her expertise in animal behavior, but for her unusual companion. Rex was a German Shepherd mix, nearly 90 pounds of muscle and intelligence, with a coat that blended dark brown and black in a pattern that seemed designed by nature for camouflage. The other researchers had initially questioned the wisdom of bringing a dog into such a remote location, but Sarah had insisted. Rex wasn't just a pet. He was a highly trained animal with an exceptional ability to sense danger and an unwavering loyalty to those he considered family. Rex had come into Sarah's life 5 years earlier, under tragic circumstances. She had been conducting research at a wildlife preserve when poachers attacked the facility, killing 3 rangers and wounding 2 others. Rex, then just a young adult, had belonged to one of the fallen rangers. The dog had stayed by his master's side for 3 days, refusing food and water, until Sarah finally managed to coax him away from the grave. The bond that formed between them in those dark days had only grown stronger with time. The dog possessed an intelligence that constantly amazed Sarah and her colleagues. He seemed to understand not just simple commands but complex situations and emotional nuances. Rex could distinguish between different members of the research team by their footsteps from over 100 yards away. He knew when someone was feeling unwell before they showed any obvious symptoms. Most importantly, he had an uncanny ability to sense when something was wrong in the surrounding forest. The Amazon had accepted their presence gradually over the first few weeks. The sounds of the jungle, initially alien and overwhelming, had become a familiar symphony. Howler monkeys announced the dawn each morning with their haunting calls. Colorful parrots chattered in the canopy above, their voices mixing with the rustle of leaves and the distant splash of fish jumping in the stream. The air was thick with humidity and rich with the scent of growing things, decomposing vegetation, and the earthy smell of soil that had never felt the touch of human tools. Dr. James Fletcher, the expedition leader, had initially been skeptical about Rex's value to the mission. A stern man in his 50s with graying hair and a no-nonsense attitude toward research, Fletcher believed that animals belonged in the wild, not as companions to humans conducting scientific work. However, even he had been forced to acknowledge Rex's contributions to their safety and well-being. The dog had already prevented 2 potentially dangerous encounters. The first occurred during their 2nd week when Rex's urgent barking and aggressive stance warned them away from a massive fur-de-lawn snake that had been coiled invisibly near their main research site. The serpent's camouflage had been so perfect that none of the humans had noticed it despite walking within striking distance multiple times. The second incident involved a jaguar that had been stalking their camp for several nights. While the big cat had likely been more curious than threatening, Rex's vigilant patrol and intimidating presence had convinced it to seek easier prey elsewhere. Sarah often found herself watching Rex as he moved through their temporary settlement, noting how he had adapted to jungle life. His ears constantly swiveled, cataloging every sound. His nose worked continuously, processing the thousands of scents that filled the air. Most remarkably, he had learned to read the behavior of the local wildlife, understanding which bird calls indicated normal forest activity and which suggested the presence of predators or other disturbances. The other team members had gradually come to appreciate Rex's presence. Dr. Corson Falmbe. Maria Santos, a botanist from Brazil, often shared her meals with the dog and had taught him to recognize several types of edible and poisonous plants. Tom Anderson, their technology specialist, had rigged up a small cooling mat powered by their solar system to give Rex relief from the oppressive heat. Even Fletcher had been seen slipping the dog treats when he thought no one was looking. But it was with Sarah that Rex's bond remained strongest. They moved together through the forest like partners who had shared countless adventures. Rex seemed to anticipate her needs, bringing her equipment before she asked, alerting her to interesting animal behavior, and providing comfort during the lonely moments that inevitably came with such isolated work. In return, Sarah ensured his health and happiness, checking him daily for cuts. Insect bites were signs of illness that could quickly become serious in such a remote location. The research itself was progressing well. The team had documented several previously unknown species of insects and identified behavioral patterns in local mammals that contradicted existing scientific literature. Their findings would contribute significantly to understanding how Amazon ecosystems functioned and how they might be better protected. Each day brought new discoveries, from tiny frogs with remarkable toxins to orchids that had never been formally classified. However, as their third month in the jungle drew to a close, subtle changes began to occur that made Rex increasingly restless. The dog's behavior shifted in ways that Sarah initially attributed to the stress of prolonged jungle living. He began sleeping less, often standing at the edge of camp staring into the darkness. His appetite decreased slightly, and he became more protective of the team members, positioning himself between them and the forest whenever possible. The wildlife around their camp also began acting strangely. The constant chatter of birds and monkeys that had provided a comforting background soundtrack grew sporadic and eventually nearly stopped altogether. The stream, which had always attracted a variety of animals for drinking and bathing, became eerily quiet. Even the insects seemed less active, though the stifling heat and humidity remained unchanged. Sarah mentioned these observations to Fletcher during one of their evening briefings, but the expedition leader dismissed her concerns as natural variations in animal behavior. The Amazon was a dynamic ecosystem, he reminded her, where changes in weather, food availability, or seasonal patterns could cause temporary shifts in wildlife activity. There was no reason to assume anything threatening was approaching their camp, but Rex knew better. His senses, far superior to any humans, had detected signs that the researchers couldn't perceive. Strange scents carried on the wind spoke of danger approaching from multiple directions. The absence of normal forest sounds indicated that every creature with the ability to flee had already done so. Most ominously, new sounds had begun filtering through the trees during the darkest hours of night. Sounds that spoke of intelligent hunters moving with purpose and coordination. Sarah trusted Rex's instincts implicitly. The dog had never shown such prolonged anxiety without cause, and his behavior was becoming more pronounced each day. She began taking additional precautions, securing equipment more carefully, and suggesting that team members stay closer to camp during their daily research activities. She also started sleeping more lightly, knowing that Rex's vigilance might be all that stood between them and some unknown threat. The jungle held its breath, waiting for something that Rex could sense but the humans could not yet comprehend. In the growing silence, the dog prepared himself for a confrontation that would test every ounce of his strength, intelligence, and loyalty. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew with absolute certainty that he would defend his human family with his life. The attack began 3 days before anyone realized they were in danger. Rex's behavior had become increasingly agitated, and he had started refusing to leave Sarah's side even for short periods. The dog would position himself at the entrance to her tent at night, lying perfectly still but with his eyes open and alert. During the day, he shadowed her movements so closely that she nearly tripped over him several times. His body language screamed of impending threat, but the jungle around them appeared as peaceful as ever. Sarah had tried explaining her concerns to the other team members during their morning briefing on what would later be remembered as the last normal day of their expedition. Dr. Fletcher listened politely but remained unconvinced that Rex's behavior indicated any real danger. The other researchers were similarly skeptical, though a few had begun to notice the unusual quiet that had settled over their section of forest. Maria Santos was the first to support Sarah's growing unease. As someone who had grown up in the Amazon region, Maria understood the rhythms and patterns of jungle life better than her colleagues. She had noticed that their daily visitors had disappeared completely. No longer did curious monkeys peer down at them from the canopy. The colorful birds that had provided endless entertainment with their antics had vanished. Even the persistent insects that had plagued them since their arrival seemed to have retreated to some safer location. Tom Anderson, their communications specialist, had been experiencing intermittent problems with their satellite equipment for the past week. At first, he attributed the difficulties to atmospheric interference or equipment aging under the harsh jungle conditions. However, as he investigated further, he began to suspect that someone or something was actively interfering with their ability to communicate with the outside world. The interference patterns didn't match any natural phenomena he had encountered, and they seemed to intensify during the nighttime hours when Rex appeared most anxious. The revelation came on the fourth night when Maria, unable to sleep due to the oppressive silence, decided to step outside her tent for some fresh air. Rex immediately materialized beside her, having somehow sensed her movement from across the camp despite making no noise. Together, they stood in the moonlit clearing, both aware that something fundamental had changed in their environment. That's when Maria saw them, barely visible shadows moving through the trees at the edge of camp. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, but as she watched more carefully, she could make out the deliberate movements of multiple figures positioning themselves around their settlement. Rex saw them too, his body going rigid with controlled aggression. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, so quiet that only Maria could hear it. The figures weren't animals. They moved with purpose and intelligence, coordinating their positions like a military unit preparing for an assault. Maria counted at least 8 distinct shadows before losing track in the dense undergrowth. Her heart began racing as she realized that their isolated research camp was completely surrounded by unknown assailants who had somehow approached without triggering any of their basic security measures. Rex's growl intensified slightly, and Maria knew they had been spotted.
One of the shadows had noticed their silhouettes in the moonlight and was likely communicating their discovery to the others.
Maria reached down slowly to touch Rex's head, hoping to keep him calm while she processed the terrifying reality of their situation.
The dog's muscles were coiled like springs, ready for explosive action, but his training and intelligence kept him from charging into a battle he couldn't win. Moving as quietly as possible, Maria and Rex retreated to Sarah's tent. The botanist gently shook her colleague awake and whispered urgently about what she had witnessed. Sarah's first instinct was to doubt the report, but one look at Rex confirmed that Maria wasn't imagining things. The dog's entire body language spoke of imminent combat. His ears were flattened against his head, his lips were slightly pulled back to reveal his teeth, and his eyes held a focus that Sarah had only seen once before, during the incident at the wildlife preserve years earlier. The three of them crept quietly to Fletcher's tent to wake the expedition leader. The older man's initial reaction was predictably skeptical until he looked outside and realized that the normal sounds of the jungle had been replaced by an ominous silence. Even Fletcher, despite his academic focus, recognized that such complete quiet in the Amazon meant that every animal in the area had fled or gone into hiding. Something was terribly wrong. Working together, they began quietly waking the other team members. Each person's reaction followed a similar pattern. Disbelief followed by growing awareness of the unnatural silence and finally acceptance that they were in serious danger. Lisa Park, their medical officer, immediately began mentally cataloging their limited medical supplies and considering how to treat potential injuries with inadequate resources. Robert Chen, their geologist, started thinking about defensive positions and escape routes through the surrounding terrain. The camp's layout, which had been designed for research efficiency and comfort, suddenly seemed woefully inadequate for defense. Their tents were scattered in a rough circle around the central research station, providing good ventilation and workspace, but offering no protection against attackers. The forest pressed close on all sides, offering countless hiding places for anyone who wished to approach unseen. Their only advantages were Rex's extraordinary senses and their small supply of emergency flares that could potentially signal for help if anyone was close enough to see them. As dawn approached with agonizing slowness, the researchers huddled together in the main research station, speaking in whispers and trying to formulate a plan. Rex positioned himself at the open doorway, every sense focused on the surrounding forest. His breathing was controlled but shallow, and Sarah could see the tension in every line of his body. The dog knew that battle was inevitable, and he was preparing himself for the fight of his life. Tom worked frantically with their communication equipment, trying to send out a distress signal before their attackers decided to move. The interference that had been plaguing their systems for days now seemed almost overwhelming, but he managed to get through a brief, broken transmission to their base station hundreds of miles away. Whether anyone had received enough of the message to understand their situation remained unclear, but it was their only hope of outside intervention. Fletcher took charge of organizing their limited defensive resources. They had no weapons beyond a few scientific tools that could potentially be used as makeshift clubs. Their emergency supplies included a small axe for clearing vegetation, several heavy-duty knives, and a basic first aid kit. Against unknown numbers of potentially armed attackers, these would be virtually useless. Their best hope lay in Rex's protective instincts and the possibility that their assailants might be discouraged by the presence of such a formidable guard dog. As the first pale light of dawn began filtering through the forest canopy, the shadows around their camp began moving again. This time, the figures made no attempt at concealment. Rex rose to his feet, every muscle in his powerful body ready for action. A deep, menacing growl rolled from his throat, not the quiet warning he had given during the night, but a full-throated challenge that announced his readiness to fight to the death for his human family. The attackers had been watching and waiting for days, learning the routines and habits of the research team. They had systematically driven away all the wildlife in the area to create the perfect hunting ground. They had interfered with communications to prevent calls for help. They had positioned themselves strategically to cut off all escape routes. Everything had been planned with military precision, except for one crucial factor they had underestimated. They had failed to account for Rex. The dog understood, with an intelligence that went far beyond simple animal instinct, that this was the moment he had been born for. All his training, all his experiences, all the bonds he had formed with his human companions had led to this confrontation. As the shadows began emerging from the forest into the pale morning light, Rex stepped forward to meet them, ready to prove that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. Sarah watched her loyal companion prepare to face impossible odds, and her heart filled with both pride and terror. She knew that Rex would never retreat, never abandon them, never stop fighting as long as breath remained in his body. In that moment, she understood that they were about to witness something extraordinary, a display of courage and loyalty that would define the true meaning of heroism. The battle for their lives was about to begin, and their survival would depend entirely on the bravery of a dog who had already decided that their lives were worth more than his own. The first attacker emerged from the tree line just as the sun crested the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp. Rex saw him clearly now, a man dressed in dark clothing, carrying what appeared to be a machete and moving with the confident stride of someone who believed he held all the advantages. The dog's response was immediate and devastating. Rex launched himself forward with explosive power, covering the 20-yard distance in seconds. The attacker, surprised by the speed and ferocity of the assault, managed to raise his weapon just as 90 pounds of muscle and fury collided with his chest. The impact sent both of them rolling across the forest floor, but Rex recovered first, his jaws clamping down on the man's weapon arm with crushing force. The machete fell harmlessly to the ground as its owner screamed in pain and terror. The sound of the first confrontation triggered chaos throughout the camp. More figures emerged from the forest on all sides, moving with the coordinated precision of a well-trained unit. There were indeed 8 of them, just as Maria had counted, all armed with various weapons, and all apparently confident that overwhelming a group of unarmed scientists would be a simple task. They had not anticipated facing an opponent like Rex. Sarah watched in amazement as her companion transformed from a loving pet into a weapon of pure protection. Rex fought with an intelligence and strategy that went far beyond animal instinct. After disabling the first attacker, he immediately released his grip and spun to face the next threat, using his superior mobility to prevent the men from surrounding him. His movements were fluid and calculated, each attack precisely targeted to neutralize weapons or disable opponents rather than simply inflict random damage. The second attacker approached from Rex's left flank wielding a heavy stick like a club. Rex feinted toward him, then suddenly changed direction as the man swung his weapon, allowing the momentum of the missed strike to throw his opponent off balance. The dog's counterattack was swift and merciless, his powerful jaws closing on the man's thigh with enough force to shatter bone. The attacker collapsed, his screams joining those of his companion. Meanwhile, Tom had managed to send another fragmented distress signal before the communication equipment was destroyed by a thrown stone. Dr. Tessa Betta Palza, Fletcher organized the research team into a tight group behind the relative shelter of their equipment station, using their few tools as makeshift weapons while Rex continued his incredible battle against impossible odds. The dog was fighting 8 trained attackers simultaneously, and somehow he was winning. Rex's strategy became clear as the battle continued. Rather than trying to kill his opponents, which would have required him to remain stationary and vulnerable, He focused on rapid strikes that disabled their weapons and mobility. His powerful jaws could crush bones, but his intelligence directed those attacks toward maximum effectiveness. Each bite was precisely placed to render an attacker helpless without requiring the dog to engage in prolonged combat with any single opponent. The third and fourth attackers tried to coordinate their assault, approaching from opposite directions to divide Rex's attention. The dog solved this problem with a display of tactical awareness that astonished the watching researchers. Rex positioned himself near a large tree, using it to protect his back while forcing his opponents to approach from a narrow front. When they rushed him together, he ducked low and swept the legs of one attacker with his powerful body while simultaneously clamping his jaws on the ankle of the other. Both men went down hard, and neither got back up. Dr.
Santos, despite her terror, found herself documenting Rex's fighting techniques with the analytical mind of a scientist. The dog was employing pack hunting strategies, but modified for solo combat against multiple opponents.
He used the terrain to his advantage, controlled the spacing of engagements, and never allowed himself to become surrounded or trapped. Most remarkably, he seemed to understand that his goal was not just to defeat the attackers, but to protect the researchers behind him, which required him to maintain position while fighting. The remaining four attackers, now realizing they were facing something far beyond their expectations, attempted to regroup and develop a new strategy. Rex used this brief lull to quickly check on his human family, ensuring they remained safely behind him while keeping his attention focused on the remaining threats. Blood stained his muzzle from his previous encounters, but he showed no signs of fatigue or hesitation. If anything, his confidence seemed to grow with each successful engagement. The fifth attacker tried a different approach, attempting to circle wide around the camp to approach the researchers from behind. Rex immediately recognized the strategy and abandoned his defensive position to intercept the flanking movement. The man never had a chance. Rex's attack was so swift and powerful that the researchers barely saw what happened. One moment the attacker was moving through the trees. The next he was on the ground with Rex standing over him, clearly disabled but still breathing.
This left three attackers, and their confidence was rapidly evaporating. They had come expecting to overwhelm a group of helpless academics, but instead they found themselves facing a guardian who seemed to anticipate their every move.
Rex had systematically dismantled their assault, turning their numerical advantage into a liability as they stumbled over their own injured companions and struggled to coordinate attacks against an opponent who moved like liquid lightning. The sixth attacker made the mistake of charging straight at Rex in a rage-fueled assault. The dog simply stepped aside at the last moment, allowing the man's momentum to carry him past, then struck with surgical precision at the back of his knee. The attacker crashed to the ground and didn't get up. Rex had learned to conserve his energy while maximizing the effectiveness of each engagement. Sarah realized that Rex was not just fighting for their lives. He was systematically destroying the attacker's will to continue the assault. Each disabled opponent served as a psychological weapon against those who remained, demonstrating that their mission had become impossible. The dog's intelligence extended beyond tactical combat to strategic warfare, understanding that breaking his enemy's spirits would be more effective than simply matching their violence. The seventh attacker hesitated, looking around at his fallen companions and clearly reconsidering his commitment to the assault. Rex sensed this hesitation and pressed his advantage, moving forward with a low, menacing growl that promised swift retribution for any further aggressive action. The man took a step backward, then another, his weapon lowering as he realized that continuing the fight would likely result in his own destruction. The final attacker, apparently the leader of the group, refused to retreat despite the overwhelming evidence that their mission had failed catastrophically. He raised his weapon and advanced toward Rex with the desperate determination of someone who knew that surrender was not an option. Rex met his challenge head-on, and their final confrontation was brief but decisive. The leader's weapon fell from nerveless fingers as Rex's jaws closed on his wrist, and he joined his companions on the ground, defeated and demoralized. In the sudden silence that followed, Rex stood among the disabled attackers, his body still tense and ready for further combat. His breathing was heavy but controlled, his eyes constantly scanning the forest for additional threats. Blood stained his coat from minor wounds sustained during the battle, but none of his injuries appeared serious. Behind him, the research team remained unharmed, protected by his incredible display of courage and skill. Fletcher approached Rex slowly, his hands empty and his voice calm and reassuring. The expedition leader, who had once questioned the wisdom of bringing a dog into the Amazon, now understood that Rex had just saved all their lives. The dog's tail began wagging slightly as he recognized that the immediate danger had passed, but he remained alert and ready to resume fighting if necessary. Sarah knelt beside her loyal companion, examining his wounds and offering the comfort and praise he had earned through his heroic actions. Rex accepted her attention gratefully, but his eyes never stopped watching the forest around them. His protective instincts remained fully engaged, understanding that their safety was still his responsibility. The disabled attackers began regaining consciousness one by one, finding themselves faced with a group of scientists who had been transformed from victims into survivors by the actions of their four-legged guardian. Dr. Park provided medical attention to prevent anyone from bleeding to death, while the others secured weapons and prepared to defend themselves if needed. However, the fight had gone out of their assailants completely. Rex's demonstration of protective fury had convinced them that any further aggression would result in even more severe consequences. Over the following hours, as they waited for the rescue helicopter that Tom's distress signals had successfully summoned, the full scope of Rex's achievement became clear. 8 armed attackers had approached their camp with the intention of robbing or harming the research team. None had escaped. All had been systematically defeated by a single dog, who understood that some bonds transcend species, some loyalties are absolute, and some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. Rex had not killed anyone, despite having the power and opportunity to do so. His intelligence had guided his actions toward protection, rather than destruction, disabling threats while preserving lives. In doing so, he had demonstrated not just courage and loyalty, but wisdom and compassion that elevated his heroism beyond simple animal instinct. When the rescue helicopter finally arrived, the pilot and emergency responders found a research camp that had been transformed into a testament to the power of interspecies bonds. Rex sat calmly beside Sarah, his duty fulfilled, and his family safe. The attackers, properly restrained and receiving medical attention, could only shake their heads when asked to explain how their carefully planned assault had been defeated by a single dog. As they prepared to leave the Amazon, Sarah looked back at the jungle that had tested them so severely and taught them so much about loyalty, courage, and the true meaning of protection. Rex would return to civilization as a hero. But more importantly, he would continue to be exactly what he had always been. A loyal companion whose love knew no limits and whose courage knew no fear. The story of their rescue spread quickly through scientific and military communities, becoming a legendary example of animal intelligence and devotion. But for Sarah and her colleagues, Rex's actions meant something far more personal. He had proven that family is not defined by species, that love can overcome any obstacle, and that true guardians never count the cost when those they protect are in danger. Rex had faced 8 attackers who intended harm to his human family, and none had escaped his justice. In the process, he had demonstrated that the bond between humans and animals can produce acts of heroism that inspire and humble all who witness them. His story became a reminder that courage comes in many forms. Loyalty knows no boundaries, and sometimes the greatest heroes walk on 4 legs instead of 2.